recording or to speak to someone directly about AB 1893. Excuse me. For ADUs, it's been reported that in 2023, ADUs accounted for 20% of new home construction in California. That's double the rate from 2020. So we're actually seeing really big production from these smaller units. In today's presentation, we'll focus more on the generally applicable laws related to streamlining, CEQA, fees, and affordable housing and financing. Before diving into the individual laws, I thought I'd identify some of the themes that we saw in the laws that we're covering this year. For streamlining, the legislature returned to the scene of its previous work on streamlined ministerial permitting, expanding the applicability of AB 2011, that's for sites zoned on commercial properties, SB 35, that's for sites zoned for residential development, and SB 684, that's for projects up to 10 units on small sites. So again, the legislature is still intending to work out the kinks every year in these laws and make them more broadly applicable. The image shown in this slide is from HCD. It shows the dramatic fall in construction starts this year. I also just saw a slide from San Jose showing that there have been 0 multifamily construction starts in all of 2024. So in attempting to acknowledge these difficult economic conditions facing housing, the legislature this year adopted an 18-month entitlement extension, allows all housing development applicants to defer applicable fees until certificate of occupancy, and also adopted several laws meant to increase the transparency on impact fees. We'll cover all of these in more detail today. And finally, for CEQA, recognizing the need for CEQA streamlining is as important as ever, the legislature extended the sunset date of several common CEQA extensions. So extensions of existing exemptions is the least we could get this year, but of course it's still necessary. So on to the streamlining laws. And before we jump into the laws that were adopted this year, we couldn't help but summarize where we are on streamlining for a very important topic, which is office to residential conversions. So AB 529 of last year's session was initially proposed as a vehicle to do something for conversions. It ended up as a law that allows cities to point to policies that promote adaptive reuse as a way to earn credits for pro-housing policy state grants. And it requires HCD to convene a working group to prepare a report on how to facilitate conversions. That report is not due until the end of 2025. I certainly wish we could hit the fast forward button on that one. And we'll continue to look for more help on conversion streamlining. In this year, AB 3068, which was intended to be the primary conversion bill, this was vetoed. It would have created a CEQA exempt ministerial pathway for qualifying adaptive reuse projects. It was modeled on AB 2011 and SB 35. It required prevailing wage as well as the more onerous skilled and trained workforce obligation for projects with more than 40 units and 4 stories. The governor vetoed it. We've included the veto message here. He vetoed it based on the labor standards as well as other provisions that the governor saw as not favorable to facilitating these conversions. There are still a few cities that have their own local conversion ordinances, for example, Los Angeles and San Francisco, and it's certainly still possible to process conversions in any city. My colleague Jenna and I actually wrote an article on conversions last year with some considerations, including best practices for CEQA and impact fees. But again, we still do not have meaningful state streamlining to facilitate conversions and look for more in the future. One more note on laws that were not adopted but are important to track. AB 3160 would have appropriated $500 million annually to the low-income housing tax credit program. It was vetoed by the governor because of the concern about creating a permanent funding obligation. AB 3190 would have required the payment of prevailing wages on affordable housing projects that receive tax credit financing. So that would have impacted the for-profit affordable housing developers that get tax credit financing, but do not receive public funding, and so they don't otherwise have a prevailing wage obligation. And so this law was enacted and signed by the governor, but it did not take effect because it was contingent on the first bill, AB 3161, taking effect. I think the linkage was that without permanent funding for tax credit financing, we shouldn't be imposing a new prevailing wage obligation. And again, I included this partially because we wanted to evidence that this push-pull between meaningful housing reform and labor obligations is alive and well. Okay, on to AB 2243. And for some reason, my slide is showing as blank. I'm sorry, can anybody confirm whether that's, oh, it's populating. We're very fancy here. Okay, AB 2243. This is one of the more notable efforts of the 2024 legislative session that attempted to broaden the eligibility of AB 2011. That law was adopted originally in 2022. It provides for ministerial CEQA exempt processing. It is for properties zoned for commercial development, office, retail, or parking. Project applicants must pay prevailing wages, but not the more onerous, skilled, and trained workforce obligation. And there are two pathways under AB 2011. There is a pathway for 100% affordable housing, and there's a pathway for mixed income projects on commercial corridors. We have seen AB 2011 used much more commonly by the 100% affordable housing developers, and so there was a big attempt this year to try to broaden the applicability.
So I always have TCAC's got to approve it here later this afternoon. Another California org, but once it does, we should be good.
First, it allows the law to be used on sites within 500 feet of a freeway.
I'm not exactly sure, but it shouldn't take too long.
Air filtration,
and
as long as balconies do not face the freeway. One more note on freeways: there's a clarification that freeways do not include on
and the one in
ramps, which
Oceanside.
I found to be a helpful clarification because I have wondered that often and looking at the eligibility of a number of projects and wondering if I need to include.
I think we were really close on the Colorado one.
500-foot calculation, so that's now clarified as not part of the freeway.
No, the one in
it also modifies the
over by the
criteria
airport,
about
5,000
surrounding
tower.
industrial uses to limit the instances in which a site loses eligibility.
They're working on Charlotte, North
So,
Carolina.
for example,
some
a site is
feedings to
not
the end of the week.
disqualified if an adjacent site isn't actually occupied by industrial uses, even though it's zoned for that.
It is kind of funny.
And a site is not disqualified if residential use is principally permitted. Another important modification here is that AB 2243 expanded the acreage limit from 20 acres to 100 acres.
Yep, you gotta do what you gotta do.
And
gotta have one.
Specific development standards, particularly for those mall sites. So it'll be really interesting to see whether any of these really large mall sites that are in need of revitalization, whether any can take advantage of this law. It also clarifies that affordability thresholds apply to base units and excludes density bonus units, as with the state density bonus law. And one amendment that goes the opposite direction, that is, it precludes eligibility under the law is if a development would require demolition of a historic structure placed on a national, state, or local historic register. So this is actually just kind of a notable list of amendments, but it's just a fraction of the amendments. I'd estimate we've covered about 10% of the amendments in AB 2243. There's still many others. They're more minor. Again, they're all intended to increase the eligibility. Another example is that on that mixed income pathway on commercial corridors, there is no longer a density limitation if it's a conversion from an existing use to residential use. So there was a little bit of an attempt to make this applicable to conversion projects as well. There's also a provision that clarifies that the project must be consistent with the objective standards of the closest parcel with the density as proposed by the applicant. So it's always an interesting exercise when you're working on projects that are commercially zoned properties and you're trying to figure out, okay, what objective standards does the project have to comply with? There's this new provision that you have to be consistent with the closest parcel that allows the density as proposed by the applicant. So that's another helpful change. But again, there's many other that we were not able to cover in the one slide per law rule. And I recommend you read them all more carefully. And I'll make one final note is that for any pending AB 2011 projects, pending on or before the end of this year, the applicant may select whether to be subject to the now old AB 2011 provisions or any of the provisions adopted pursuant to AB 2243. So there's a little bit of a pick and choose ability for those pending AB 2011 applications. Next, we have amendments to SB 35, and they're going to populate with our fancy little tool. As you likely know, SB 35 was one of our original ministerial processing laws. It provides, again, CEQA exempt ministerial processing. Now, this is for projects on residentially zoned properties. The labor requirements have been softened in recent years by SB 423. Now it is a prevailing wage only requirement for buildings less than 85 feet. It's not skilled in trade. That's only for the projects over 85 feet. And even in that case, there's an ability to, we call it off-ramp from the skilled and trained if you don't get the requisite number of bids provided by the law. The range of affordability depends on the project location and the jurisdiction's progress towards meeting regional housing goals. There's numerous infill criteria. And again, this has largely been used by 100% affordable housing developers. The amendments this year in AB 3122 are pretty minor, I would say, but also kind of narrowly important, and that there are new qualifications required to process a subdivision map along with the SB 35 application. So if your project will seek a low income housing tax credit, and if it is in an incorporated city or with an urbanized area or urban cluster in an area in a county, those are all very defined terms, you can then process your subdivision map along with your SB 35 application and have it, again, all be CEQA exempt and ministerially processed. If you don't meet those criteria, it is important to then determine a separate subdivision map strategy. So that's always something that's really important to look out for. This year's amendments also define the range within which a project may be modified post-entitlement and retain the ministerial processing. So one of the brackets here generally is that the project can be modified up to 15% increase in construction square footage and a 15% decrease in residential units, all post-entitlement. And the purpose of this is to, I saw the author's language was to allow applicants to have the ability to right-size a project after entitlement and still maintain this ministerial process. There's also a new obligation for local government to respond within 30 days to an application resubmittal. So all of that is intended to keep the process moving very swiftly. And then finally, our last ministerial law is SB 1123, which reforms SB 684 from last year. This law is available to small projects, less than 10 units on less than 5 acres. Very notably, there is no BMR obligation and no labor requirement for this ministerial process, which is distinct from the others that I've covered. There's numerous infill criteria that you do have to satisfy. As with the others, the project also has to be consistent with local objective standards. However, there are a few limitations, meaning that these projects do not have to be consistent with certain development standards. For example, minimum FAR or setbacks. So you get some relief on compliance with a number of development standards. The real hitch was that when this was adopted last year, it was only available in site zone for multifamily development. There was some back and forth on that last year as to how broadly this would apply, but it was only available in site zone for multifamily development. So the real change this year is SB 1123 changes that so that it is now available in single family zoned properties if the site is also vacant. And there's some definitions of vacancy, of course, determined whether you have an occupant. Also, it is determined by whether you have any reported BMR obligation or any local rent control that applies. But it should be a pretty significant change to allow this type of development, less than 10 units, on single family zoned property. There's also an amendment that provides more specific guidance on permitted densities and clarifies that ADUs and junior ADUs do not count towards the density limits. So that being said, there is a way to really kind of rack up your units if you're developing the up to 10 units and then also allowed to do ADUs and JADUs. And then it also adds lot frontage to the list of development standards with which a project does not need to comply. So again, you get relief. I had a project where it was a great relief to worry about that development standard and then find that, oh, we don't have to comply with that. And then I'll just close by noting some of the legislative findings about this law. There were findings about home ownership. There's some interesting statistics about for sale homes accounted for only 5.4% of multifamily starts and only 2.7% of single family and multifamily home starts in 2021. So there is a real desire to increase home ownership opportunities. In particular, there's also legislative findings that we quoted about how home ownership is identified as an important tool to close racial and ethnic wealth gaps in the state and the country. So I have a feeling this is going to be another sleeper. It doesn't seem like much. We kind of brushed it off as a lower unit count, but really could add up to big changes as we've seen with the ADU loss. And lastly, moving beyond the ministerial laws to our final batch of streamlining laws. These streamlining laws, I would say, reflect some demographic trends, at least the first two. AB 2694 extends the state density bonus law to residential care facilities for the elderly. You may know that the state density bonus law already applies to senior housing and shared housing, and this year's amendments make it crystal clear that it also applies to these RCFEs, better known as, I would call them assisted living facilities. AB 3116 also extends some additional benefits to student housing. Again, this is, I think, reflecting demographic trends, and it adds to the prior benefits for student housing. Specifically, it increases the density bonus from 35% to 50%. And it also can eliminate parking. Finally, SB 951 for San Francisco. Any action on a coastal development permit that is in the coastal zone may no longer be appealed to the Coastal Commission. So this was a part of a batch of bills that were intended to facilitate and streamline housing approvals in the coastal zone. For example, there was one to allow density bonus in the coastal zone, to exempt ADUs, and to shorten the statute of limitations for challenges to housing in the coastal zone. Those all faltered. This is the one that remained and was enacted, and we expect to see another real push to streamline housing in the coastal zone. And I know there's a lot of focus on the Coastal Commission and wanting to see some reduction there. With that, I will turn it over to Ms. Jenna to cover CEQA laws.
Thanks, Chelsea. So as Chelsea mentioned toward the beginning of the presentation when she was talking about themes for today, you'll see we've scratched out that CEQA has been fundamentally reformed and noted that it has been slightly tweaked around the edges. So this slide is the first three laws we're going to talk about. The first is AB 2553. So CEQA provides for some exemptions and streamlining options that rely on proximity to what CEQA defines as a major transit stop. So this law, I think in recognition of COVID-19 impacting the frequency of service for a lot of local agencies, transit buses specifically, has expanded qualification. It's no longer a requirement for the frequency of service for the two intersecting bus stop lines to be 15 minutes or less. Now it is 20 minutes or less. And I would say that in the last couple of years that we've helped assess these for projects, we found some that are kind of on the cusp of between 15 and 20 minutes. So I do expect this will allow more projects to be exempt from CEQA. AB 2117 has to do with extending the life of development permits during a pending action in court. So it's not limited to CEQA related challenges. So it might also apply to, say, for example, challenges under the planning and zoning laws, but it does notably apply to CEQA. So it also applies to kind of traditional discretionary land use entitlements like a variance, a conditional use permit, design review, site development permit, whatever they're called by the local agency, but it does not apply to building permits, grading permits, excavation and demo permits, things that are kind of issued pursuant to a building code. So any non-discretionary post-entitlement permit that is needed to actually begin construction. And the next one is AB 1413. So this one has to do with last year's law, AB 1633. AB 1633 aimed to provide some limited ability for applicants to challenge an agency's refusal to use a CEQA exemption, where the applicant can demonstrate that the project qualifies for one, or in situations where the agency has prepared an EIR for the applicant to kind of help force them to actually certify that EIR if it is demonstrably sufficient for legal purposes. So 1413 aims to, I think, provide a little bit more public transparency into AB 1633's process. It requires that the party that wants to kind of force the agency to take a certain action provides notice to the agency of the reasons why they think the agency should be making a different decision. And this new law requires that the agency, when it gets that notice, it has to post it publicly and allow for a comment period of 60 days. And then it has to actually consider those responses that it gets from the public, if it gets any, in ultimately determining whether to alter their CEQA determination. So the next category is 4 laws spread over 2 slides that have to do with extending CEQA exemptions. So the first is AB 2199, and this has to do with a infill exemption that is available in unincorporated county areas for housing projects and mixed-use projects that contain housing. It does not actually expand the applicability of the exemption. It is pretty limited already, so you should review it carefully. It's not super widely available, but it does extend the exemption until the year 2032. It, in fact, also adds a qualifying criteria. So it already excludes from the exemption projects that cause impacts on things like historic resources, other impacts categories as well, but it now adds an exception to the exemption for projects that cause a substantial impact to tribal cultural resources. So that one is more limited now. SB 1395 has to do with extending the exemption for homeless shelters and low barrier navigation centers. So for contracting for services for homeless shelters, it extends the exemption for the decision to approve those contracts from 2026 to 2036. The law also expands the definition of what is a low barrier navigation center that qualifies for the exemption. It now includes non-congregate and relocatable facilities. So for example, there's a company, I'm trying to think of the name. Dignity Moves has a small location in San Francisco that's kind of these removable short-term navigation centers that potentially could fall into this exemption. It also deletes the sunset date for low barrier navigation centers. So there is a sunset date for contracts for homeless shelter services. There's no longer any sunset date for low barrier navigation centers. And this importantly covers not just decisions to approve the projects, but also to lease property, provide financial assistance to those projects, or approve contracts and provide services, as I mentioned. And the other two are also about existing exemptions and extending them. So SB 312 extends the sunset date for a CEQA exemption for a public university housing project. The exemption was originally adopted a few years ago in response to the People's Park decision in Berkeley. So it extends that exemption from 2030 to 2032. So just a few years, but notable. And the exemption previously had some qualifications related to LEED certification. So the project had to be LEED certified, and it had to receive that certification before it was able to receive its certificates of occupancy. This amendment, SB 312, will change that. So I think you can receive the LEED certification up to 18 months after your COO, and then there's 2 6-month extensions of that available, so you can extend it even further and get your LEED certification later. The last one in the CEQA category is going to be AB 3057, and this is an exemption for JDUs, junior accessory dwelling units. CEQA has already exempted from its provisions an action by an agency to kind of adopt an ordinance related to the approval of ADUs. 3057 just expands that exemption and specifically now includes junior ADUs. Okay, so the next category after CEQA will be fees. The first one that's made a lot of waves is SB 937. This is one that we hear concerns about from our development community clients a lot, is the timing of paying their impact fees. And SB 937 will allow designated residential development projects to defer those payments until final inspection or the first certificate of occupancy, whichever occurs first. This law importantly does not impact the date that the fee is calculated. So you'll have to still look at the agency's provisions on kind of when they're calculated. For many, it's building permit. So it doesn't affect that. It's just the date that you have to actually pay those fees. This law also does not apply if you do not then begin your construction within 5 years of receiving your building permit. Agencies also are allowed to require the fee payment. It doesn't have to be in kind of one lump. The agency can decide whether they want it in kind of a few different tranches on a pro rata basis when certain milestones are reached, or they can accept it in a lump sum when the entire project is complete. And this law doesn't apply to all residential projects. It applies to those that are fit within the definition of a designated residential development project, which includes 100% low-income projects, projects that are eligible for a state density bonus law density bonus. Importantly, there it says, entitled to, eligible. It doesn't, you don't have to actually be seeking or receive a bonus. You just have to be eligible. Projects that are 10 or fewer units, and projects that are being approved pursuant to streamlined processes such as AB 2011, SB 35, and SB 4. SB 4 has been called Yes in God's Backyard. So that's the by right approval process for projects that are owned by religious institutions and nonprofit colleges. And then lastly, the agency is allowed to charge the fees earlier than COO or final inspection if they can demonstrate that they are to reimburse the agency for expenditures that the agency has already made, or where they have kind of planned ahead and already established an account with funds that are appropriated for a specific improvement project, and they've been adopted a construction schedule for that to be completed. This last exception I'm talking about, though, does not apply where the project involved consists of 49% or more lower income units.
And Jenna, if I might, I was going to hop in with just two little points here. The first is that exemption there about determining whether the agency has previously made expenditures on a certain type of infrastructure. We are getting requests from clients, and it does require a bit of research. It does seem worth the research. In fact, the Turner Center's Making It Pencil report kind of quantified the value and quantified on average that the deferral of impact fees could save as much as 1% of total development costs. So I'm sure many of those on the line, so to speak, are know this better than we do, but I think every bit helps, right?
Thank you, Chelsea. Okay, so a few other laws related to fees. The first is AB 2553. So in addition to modifying the definition of a major transit stop, which AB 2553 already did, as we discussed on an earlier CEQA slide, 2553 also expands the requirement to impose lower traffic mitigation fees for housing projects that are located near transit, requiring lower fees for projects that are within a defined transit priority area, and that's a defined term in CEQA, where the relevant major transit stop that qualifies the site as a transit priority area will be completed within 1 year of the project's occupancy. And then they also have to, the site also has to be close to convenience retail uses within 1/2 mile of those. The site also has to be below a certain parking threshold, so not be overparked. AB 3012 and AB 1822 go together, so they both have to do with requiring local agencies to create online fee estimate tools for development impact fees, utility connection fees, those types of things. AB 3012 indicates that the fee estimate tool has to address fees including but not limited to those that are imposed pursuant taxes and district or CFD taxes. The agencies, though, I mean, they're not kind of bound to the estimate that they provide. So it's meant to be a tool for estimation. They're not bound to the accuracy of that information. Also, starting July 1, 2028, HCD must prepare a fee schedule template that may be used by cities and counties, as well as a list of best practices. Similarly, AB 1820 allows housing applicants to submit concurrent with their SB 330 application, their SB 330 preliminary application, which, as you may know, kind of vests applicable local requirements and impact fees as of the date of the pre-app. So when they submit that pre-app, they can also submit a request for an estimate of all fees and exactions. The agency has to provide an estimate within 30 days. If the agency that is imposing the fee is not the entity that's approving the project, so say, for example, a school district fee, which is collected by a separate entity, you have to make that request to that separate agency. It wouldn't be to the city if you're seeking a city approval, for example. The next one is AB 2430. So this law prohibits an agency from imposing a monitoring fee on the continued affordability of a housing development project. This one is an attempt to avoid the duplication of monitoring responsibilities and fees, where a state funding agency, so that's either the California TCAC, California Housing Finance Authority, or HCD, will otherwise be monitoring the long-term affordability of the regulated units. This is specifically for projects that receive a state density bonus law bonus. And it doesn't just look forward to future projects. It also provides that if an eligible housing development is currently subject to a fee, it will no longer be subject to that fee beginning on January 1, 2025. So
mine's still working.
The fees they'll be subject to are those that are implemented.
Oh, you have to click every once in a while to stay in it.
So not the local agency.
Oh,
AB 2663 requires inclusionary housing fee reports. So the Mitigation Fee Act already requires that agencies provide public information about what the bases are for certain fees, and provide reports online in kind of 5-year time periods. This law, AB 2663, would expand that to include a reporting for how the local government has used money from its affordable housing fund to pay legal fees to defend itself in a housing lawsuit. This is one that happened recently, and there was that issue. So this new law requires the local entity to collect inclusionary housing in lieu fees and post that information on its website, and also tell you how much was collected and whether they're intended to be used for a certain project. Beginning on January 1, 2026, and every 5 years thereafter, the agency must also post the amount of fees collected in the past 5 years and the projects for which that fee was spent. Notably, a separate provision of the Mitigation Fee Act does require agencies to refund unspent fees if they do not make required findings within 5 years of a fee deposit. So AB 2663's increased reporting on inclusionary fees could result in additional monitoring of the use of fees, and in some cases result in return of more unused fees than are returned now. And I will turn it over to Andy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jenna. Hello, everybody. If this were Jeopardy, this would be the potpourri category of several notable laws that deal with constraints on housing or lessen constraints on housing. And the first is AB 2729. The legislature has adopted somewhat of a pattern of recognizing periods of financial hardship or crisis and extending the length of housing entitlements. Here, in a narrow window of entitlements issued before January of 2024 that are going to expire before the end of 2025, if you're a specifically defined housing development project, essentially at least 2/3 residential, then you have an 18-month extension of those entitlements. And this extension doesn't apply if a DA is in place or if a subdivision map has already been extended pursuant to SB 9, or if you're in an SB 330 early vesting situation. And mirroring similar provisions elsewhere in the new housing laws, if there's a legal challenge in place with respect, or pending with respect to the entitlements, the 18-month extension gets tolled. SB 1210 responds to an emerging pattern that the housing development community has identified, that the pathway between obtaining entitlements and construction has been stretched for any number of reasons. And SB 1210 attempts to respond to that pattern that home builders have identified with poor information and poor timing estimates for utility service connections by requiring all but the smallest of specifically defined utilities to post publicly on their websites estimated fees and timelines for connections to utilities allocated to differing housing types. Advance, apologies. Next is AB 2580, reporting on historic designations. We've coined the phrase internally from one of our partners' descriptions with respect to another statute of the camel's nose under the tent to identify those statutes that may be harbingers of future legislation and future housing fights. And this may be one of them. This is substantively a reporting obligation for cities and counties with respect to housing opportunity tracking that they're already required to do under their housing element reporting. But it now brings historic preservation into the content of what they're reporting on. Specifically, if they are evaluating sites or have identified housing opportunity sites with historic implications, they are now required to report whether it's been entitled, whether permits have been issued, number of units in the project. We see a pattern here, which we'll probably see on the horizon for years to come, of historic being used as a cudgel to stop housing development. And this is the beginnings of a legislative response to that. I will note that our marketing folks did locate this terrific image on the slide, but the historic nature of properties that will be covered by the statute are not just those on the National Register, but on any state or local list of historic places as well.
And Andy, could you just briefly describe, let's just trade notes here a little bit, ways in which you've seen historic preservation laws weaponized? What I've seen is existing homeowners trying to get their neighborhoods, or maybe it's an individual building, designated on their register so that the development of that neighborhood or building becomes more difficult going forward. Is that your same experience?
Yeah, we're certainly. I'm sorry, Chelsea, continue your thought.
That was it.
Okay. Yes, I'm seeing it in single family locations, and we're also seeing it in infill locations where there are historic resources, especially in historic districts, where coming to a focus is the laudable concerns for protecting historic resources and how those weigh out against the need to increase density in areas located proximate to jobs and transit. And it's not a matter of which one wins, but it's a matter of what the process is going to be going forward. And I think this is one of those categories of watch this space. We'll see more in the future.
Thanks, Andy.
So in the category of affordable housing and finance, a few things of note. AB 846, and if there's any pattern here, it's this word we've used called aligning or alignment. We see a couple of legislative acts trying to repair disparities in treatment between various different types. Here, despite project-based requirements and income qualification for tenants, tax credit developments didn't meet the health and safety code definitions for affordable rents, and therefore weren't able to take advantage of protective laws and programs promoting affordable housing development. And the legislature responded to this unintended disincentive with AB 846, which simply adds to the definition of affordable rents consistent with tax credit allocation requirements or bond or program limits under these programs. If you're compliant under the tax credit program, then your rents are affordable rents, even though, for example, low-income housing tax credit deals don't set specific limits on rents based on that individual tenant. The legislation also addresses the exemptions that tax credit projects previously had under Costa-Hawkins, which regulated how fast and how steep rents could increase in certain projects, and have directed the Tax Credit Allocation Committee to adopt regulations and annually assess their protocols for limiting annual adjustments on rents and tax credit properties. So, with this caveat, the rules affecting low-income housing tax credit investments are complex. This is not a tax credit program. If it were, I would not be presenting. For specific tax credit program, including how you qualify for any of these things, do get in touch with us. We can refer you to the appropriate H&K professional. Okay, another alignment statute involved AB 1868 and the welfare exemption, which is well known to providers of affordable rental housing as a means of qualifying for an exemption from property taxes for a multifamily rental project because it was owned by a nonprofit entity. The challenge was that where a rental property could qualify for the exemption, for ownership properties, there was a disparate result. This became known as the Habitat for Humanity model. If a nonprofit was creating housing and then making it available to low-income households for ownership, either through long-term ground leases or recorded grants, some taxing authorities in high-value communities were reading the revenue and taxation laws as requiring them to recognize the value of those grants and to impose property taxes on the end affordable user because they were not a nonprofit. The statute responds to this by that providers such as Habitat for Humanity had identified by creating a rebuttable presumption that these encumbrances that promote ownership should be disregarded for purposes of assessment valuation. And that takes us through potpourri and through these alignment statutes, and we have some time for Q&A.
Yeah, thank you all. So we have been monitoring the Q&A and answering the ones that we can as quickly as we can, but there were a couple that we wanted to share with the crowd. One was, of course, we always use acronyms, BMR, I think I use that term, that stands for below market rate. Another question, somebody noted that SB 684, again, that's the law to streamline housing developments and subdivisions that are less than 10 units. An audience member noted that there are no provisions in that law limiting it in the coastal zone, and observing, and this is very true, that the other laws, SB 9, SB 35, the ADU laws, typically have language saying that the ministerial law does not supersede, alter, or lessen the effect of the Coastal Act. While I'm very tempted to search it up and check that myself, I'm going to assume that that is the case and there's no hidden little cross-reference. If that is the case, that there's no limitation in the coastal zone, the question is, what are our thoughts or experience on whether a coastal development permit would still be required? I would say that it would not be required. So for any of these ministerial laws, and it has taken a little while to get used to it, where the code normally says you have to get a conditional use permit or go through some discretionary process. Again, as long as this law does not have any carve out for a coastal zone, I would add it to the list, the coastal development permit list of applications you do not need to process through a discretionary process. So that could be, like I said, it's a sleeper. I think we'll see more of it. And if this is also confirmed, that's another real huge benefit there. Jenna, any questions you want to answer?
Sure, yeah. So there was a question about the 937, which was the ability to pay impact fees at the time of COO or final inspection. And I mentioned in the presentation that if you don't end up beginning your construction within 5 years of receiving your building permit, you are no longer eligible to pay the fee at COO. And the question was kind of, how is that implemented? Is it, do you pay during the 5th year? And all that the law says is that the extension for payment doesn't apply to you if your construction doesn't begin within that 5 years. So I assume it would be kind of the beginning of year 6 that they probably come after you. But I think that the 5-year provision is kind of a backstop that may not be relevant all that often, because if you haven't begun your construction within 5 years, you're probably outside the life of your land use entitlement and might need to seek a new one and, you know, pay the new fees anyway.
Thanks. And Andy, you've had all of 2 minutes to review the questions. Did you get a chance to catch any directed towards your content?
There is one on 2729 that got forwarded by a couple of steps. And if I understand the question, it was, could we reconcile you don't get an additional 18 months if you've already been extended by some particular extensions, such as SB 9, and the questioner said, we've been extended by the city, assuming it was not pursuant to SB 9 and that you otherwise qualify. That means your approval were prior to 24 and are going to expire in by the end of 25. I think you would qualify for the additional 18-month extension. But if that city action was pursuant to SB 9, you may have an issue and may need to go back to the city.
Great, thank you all. Okay, we are going to wrap up with some excuse me, final observations. We will get a list of your questions, so if you have more, please keep sending them or email us or contact us directly for more questions and conversations. But our final slide here is a little bit of an observation on what we see on the horizon. First, a comment on the Prop 5 and Prop 33 failures. Prop 33, as you likely know, it would have repealed the Costa-Hawkins Act and granted local governments greater authority to implement rent control and on more types of housing, including new units and single-family homes. That attempt to repeal Costa-Hawkins has now failed several times, but who knows if we'll see it come back again. Separately, Prop 5 would have reduced the voter approval threshold for local bonds funding affordable housing. It would reduce the threshold from 2/3 to 55%, would have made it easier to secure financing for essential projects. So taken together, it feels like we dodged one bullet, but we're hit by another one. I think there's still a desire for something bigger and bolder in terms of reform. We've adopted collectively, the royal we, the state has adopted proudly, I think we're probably around 300 laws, housing laws at this point, and yet we're still not seeing the production that we want to see, and so I think there's a desire for breaking the mold even further and recognizing ministerial approvals for consistent projects that are consistent with the general plan and zoning, more ministerial processing and secret exemptions for infill projects. I think that's what all of us who want more housing would like to see. But in fact, we are seeing permitting declines. I showed some slides and talked about it at the top of the hour. But then there's a question about what that will mean for the housing elements, where cities won't meet their aggressive new unit targets. And again, we can focus on streamlining entitlements and trying to make the process faster, but it certainly feels like the problem right now is costs. And there's a question, though, of what the state can do about costs. I'm personally really interested in efforts to look at building codes and consider whether we can hit pause on building code updates that would exacerbate the current economic infeasibility that we're seeing, and looking at any other ways that we can get some relief and make these costs more feasible. Jenna, you had also raised a point about local fees.
Yeah, so we mentioned during the presentation that there were some laws that aimed at increased transparency about impact fees, how they're spent, what they're used for. I see, though, in the future, kind of future fallout of the Sheets case and increased scrutiny about fees, the impacts that they are meant to be mitigating, and ensuring that local agencies have adopted all of the relevant studies that they need to adopt to be able to charge those fees. Also, so perhaps some challenges to those coming in the future. And then also processing fees. So we've seen a lot of requirements expanding the Mitigation Fee Act to include more procedure and reporting for impact fees, but really not anything about processing fees, which vary really widely among different jurisdictions.
And I am starting the San Jose slide I mentioned earlier. That was in connection with a pretty significant reduction in inclusionary obligations for existing projects that are already approved. So hope to see more of that kind of relief for this period of time. One note here, you may have heard Buffy Wicks is organizing permitting reform sessions. It's really intended to talk about the post-entitlement issues, some really scary stories that we've been hearing about. And I think there's a focus on ensuring that the post-entitlement process works better, and also that third-party districts and other agencies that are involved in permitting a project, that everybody works together for our common goal. And Andy, you had a few final observations as well.
Yeah, I alluded to historic becoming a potential issue that we'll see more of for housing opportunity in the future. I think that's continues to be the case. The other thing, at least from the perspective of in Southern California and the city of Los Angeles, yesterday again, the city council declined the opportunity to densify or to allow greater density in single-family zoned neighborhoods, which in the city of LA are close to 60% of the property within the city boundaries. I think that's just going to put greater pressure on infill locations to solve the housing needs. Some of the academic research says it can't arithmetically be done in that portion. So I think we're going to continue to see in the Southern California communities these battles over what single-family zoning means and what its responsibility of those areas is to solve the housing crisis.
That sounds right. Well, we are 1 minute over. We thank you for joining us. We again have a link to our full annual housing law recap article. The only thing we like more than reading and teaching the new laws is to actually implement them. So reach out to us, ask questions. Let's figure out how we can put these laws to practice. Thank you so much for joining us, and we hope to see you sometime soon.